Great. Well, kia ora everyone, kia ora koutou, and welcome to, oh yes, people are starting to come in here. There we are. That's great. So welcome and thank you for coming along at this Tuesday lunchtime for a Wetlands and Your Farm Environment Plan webinar with Nathan Burkepile there from the Hawke's Bay and the New Zealand Landcare Trust. And we've got Caitlin Morrison, who's a wetland scientist at the Waikato Regional Council. And I'm Nadine Berry I'm the Waikato Regional Coordinator here for the New Zealand Landcare Trust. And so as people are coming in, as you're coming in, make sure you've got something to eat, something to drink, and you're in a comfy chair. There's a bit of rain outside, so hopefully we'll get a few more people coming along today. And we'll start off with the karakia, and then we'll move into Nathan's presentation. You have, because we're on Zoom, we've got a chat function here. So if you've got any questions as we go along, just pop them into the chat. And we have got some questions that have been sent in beforehand, so we'll deal with those at the end of the presentation. And it should take about half an hour, and we've got a little bit of extra time after that for questions and answers. So I'll kick into it, starting us off today with karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Ehi aki ana, te aka kura, ki tio, he huka, he hau, hu, ti hei, mauri ora. I'll hand over to you, Nathan.
Kia ora. My name is Nathan Burkepile. I'm with New Zealand Landcare Trust. I'm the Hawke's Bay Regional Coordinator. And just to let you guys know, if you have any questions, just put it in the chat box, and we will answer those questions at the end of the presentation as we go. We have quite a few people on today, and we've got some people who probably know more about wetlands than I do on here. So if we can't answer your question, somebody here will be able to. So today we're going to talk about wetlands and your farm environment plan. So as we know that everybody's got to have a farm environment plan over the next couple of years for their farms, and how do wetlands fit into that farm environment plan, and what and more about thinking about prioritizing and where you're going to go with your farm environment plan and wetlands. So what goes into a farm environment plan? They vary a little bit, but for the most part, your farm environment plan has mapping. And in that mapping, your person who is doing that, or yourself, will just be able to identify those wetlands and mark them on the maps. Critical source areas will be identified, and we'll touch base on why those are important around wetlands. Stock exclusion planning, that's important around wetlands and around some GMP. And then a little bit of how you set an action list and prioritize the wetlands you want to manage on your farms. We'll start out with a freshwater policy statement, which is the recent little piece of legislation that's come through, and policy 6. And this is where a lot of this stems from. There's no further loss of extent of natural inland wetlands. Their values are protected and the restoration is promoted. This all deals with mainly that wetlands are probably one of the most threatened and endangered ecosystems in New Zealand, with only 10% of wetlands left. And we're seeing a signal that there's some value in protecting those. The Resource Management Act defines a wetland as to include permanently or intermittently wet areas, and it's really important to think about those intermittently wet areas. Those are what we call ephemeral wetlands or seasonal wetlands, and they're pretty good part of our ecosystem and have important wildlife in, such as mudfish and a few other things that are important, that we've lost most of those. Wetlands are basically shallow water and land water margins. Those land water margins are basically those little wetland margins around lakes, because lakes aren't considered a wetland, but there's that margins that have those wetland values. And And the most important part is they support a natural ecosystem of plants and animals that are adapted to those systems. And we'll go into a little bit around those adapteds. And a lot of people think wetlands have a lot of open water. Some do. Some could be completely covered with sedges or shrubs and trees, and you don't have any open water. So they do vary. There's a little bit of confusion around this legislation when it came out, and we'll just kind of clear some of that up. Around the wetland protection, it does not include your constructed wetlands, whether you've constructed one for aesthetics or for waterfowl hunting or those kind of things. Those aren't included in the legislation. I won't really touch on geothermal wetlands because they're kind of a unique little area. And then section C is really interesting. This any area of improved pasture that at the commencement date, and that's the commencement date of the freshwater policy statement, which was 2 years ago. That is dominated by exotic pasture species and subject to temporary rain-derived water pooling. And this is where we lost a lot of our ephemeral wetlands, and those areas that have in the past been improved for exotic pasture aren't part of the legislation. But if you do have one that hasn't been improved, it is now protected under the legislation. When I look at wetlands, I don't go by the legislative aspects of it. I go by what we look for. We look for hydrology. Where is the water present at the surface or within the growing root zone of the plants? So again, wetlands are wet land. So it could look dry in the top, but it just a centimeter down, it could be completely saturated, and that's a wetland. And there's plants that are adapted to growing in those saturated soils. And those are usually flatland plants. So we look at the hydrology of the area. We look at hydric soils, and those hydric soils have some tendencies to a peat soils. They're very hydric soils, which you guys have a lot up in the Waikato. A lot of non-peat soils are gray because they lack oxygen and that kind of thing. So we use soils as a way of identifying. And our main way and the easiest way to identify it is what plant and animal species we find using those wetlands. So when we're delineating wetlands or when we're trying to determine what's a wetland, we have plant species that we call obligate that require wet root system or growing in water. And those are usually what we use to define what a wetland is. There's some facultative species that grow wet, dry, and they're sort of an indicator, but again, they handle dry really well. So we really look for those facultative plant species, rushes, and some of your sedges, your balmias, that kind of thing that grow with the roots in a water system. A little bit around definitions, because I'll make some comments about things and you'll know where I'm coming from. Restoration basically refers to returning a wetland to a former condition, and that definition's changing a little bit and moving away from that former condition because we might not be able to do the former condition, but restoration is basically moving that wetland to where it is functioning properly. Creation is establishing wetlands in a location where they never previously existed. Enhancement refers to activities that increase the particular function of wetland, and usually your wetland plantings and that kind of thing are actually enhancements and not really restorations. It's enhancing the wetland. And then we've got constructed wetland, and this one's kind of important because we'll have a chat about that. And the constructed wetlands came from treating municipal industrial waste and some stormwater runoff, and we've used these constructed wetlands to improve water quality on agricultural lands, and we'll have a little bit of chat with this. But a constructed wetland is basically a subset of created wetlands, but it's created for the purpose of water cleaning. So you get your farm environment plan, you're sitting there, your advisor gives it to you, and you're looking at it and you're like, oh my goodness, there's a lot of stuff here. What do I do and where do I start first? And it comes around prioritizing what you do first. And I find it, first you go and you look at your farm environment plan, and it's just like, okay, we've got a wetland over here and we've got a wetland over here. So priority is actually excluding those from stock. It's a legal requirements, and but it should be your first priority. those wetlands are important. They need to be protected, and fencing from livestock is critical. Everybody will ask me, you know, what's how far away should I fence from a wetland? You can't legally, you can't spray within 10 meters of wetlands. So that's actually a pretty good buffer. The farther buffer, the more of a buffer you can give a wetland, the better that wetland will be able to function, because it requires a little bit of dry land to function properly. So give it what you give, as much space as you can. As you're looking at your farm environment plan, you're like, okay, we've already fenced off our wetlands, we plan to fence off over the next couple of years, our wetlands, get those done. We've got these little areas over here where our grandfather tried to drain a wetland at one time. It didn't drain properly. It's wet and mucky. Can we restore it? And then that's where your next priority is all right, where can I restore some wetlands to actually improve water quality or biodiversity on our farm? And usually restoring wetlands requires fixing the hydrology of the wetlands. And then after that's fixed, is excluding stock from those wetlands. So when you're prioritizing your farm environment plan, start with existing wetlands. They're important, then move down to the restoring wetlands, so we can actually reverse that decline of wetlands. And then, you know, if you're in a high nutrient area, you can start looking at your farm environment plan, say, where can I construct some wetlands to actually improve water quality before the water goes out into our streams and waterways? And that's where we would look at our farm environment plan and say, oh, there's a few places here where water runs off. I can put a constructed wetland and we can improve water quality. So you just slowly work through that, and over your plan over the next 5, 10 years, 15 years, you're like, this is what we're going to do over time, and move through those. And that's when you have your plan. That's the best approach to have. Not much can be said about wetland protection, but I really want to point out some wetlands don't have open water, and they need to be protected, basically livestock excluded. I want to touch a little bit on seepage wetlands, because seepage wetlands sort of fall between the cracks. The policy statement recognizes wetlands that are half a hectare or greater, and most of your seepage wetlands are small and don't fall into that, but they're incredibly important. Research by Dairy and Zed have shown that these seepage wetlands improve water quality really well. So a little bit of protection of fencing around these seepage wetlands is probably something that you should plan on doing. And really, they're boggy and cause problems with stock, and not really that expensive to do. You'll find them usually in gully systems, which are actually fairly easy to fence, but they're well worth looking at. So as you're doing your farm environment plan, you gotta say, well, I can do all this stuff and it can get overwhelming. So we got to weigh the cost and benefits of these things. So seepage wetlands, basically, like I said, they're low cost, easy to implement, doesn't require a lot of knowledge. You see the seepage coming out. It's a bit of fencing, cheap and easy to maintain. A little bit of planting if there's no native plants in there, flaxes, some sedges, cabbage trees. They have a small land requirement. Again, they're usually tiny, very small usually. And they have some biodiversity values. And actually, those seepage wetlands is quite interesting of finding that we find eels sometimes, or tuna, and sometimes in those seepage wetlands. They bury themselves into the mud and that kind of thing. So they do provide some cultural value to them. And by planting them up and having them grow and protected, they'll reduce downstream flooding. So, but there's disadvantages. You can't put high strength effluent down through them because they can't handle that. And there's a potential if you can install small weirs through a seepage system to just slow that water down and allow it to work through that ground layer. And if you put those weirs in, there's a little bit of a maintenance cost. It's just something to consider when you're doing your plan, your maintenance cost of these things. Restoring a wetlands, usually wetlands are in poor production area. They were drained at one time, usually not properly drained, they kind of are scrubby, that kind of thing. So you don't, if you restore the wetland, you don't lose a lot of production. Actually, they're easy and cheap to maintain once you get them restored, the hydrology restored and plants in. They generally take care of themselves. A little bit of weed maintenance throughout time, and it's something you got to consider is weed maintenance as it goes. As it matures, that weed maintenance drops. Actually, lower cost than a constructed wetland, mainly because a lot of times it's just blocking some drainage and that kind of thing. So restoring wetlands is that's why I say it's a second priority. And of course, it has high biodiversity values, especially here where we only have 10% of our wetlands left. That every little bit of wetland restore actually increases the biodiversity. And again, helps reduce downstream flooding because it holds water on the landscape and prevents, and then that water slowly seeps out. So when we get big storm events, the water acts like a sponge and pulls it up. So there's a lot of advantages to restoring wetlands. Again, it's not suitable for a high strength effluent. You're not going to be restoring a wetland and putting a piggery right next to it and putting all your effluent down through the wetlands. But it will do a good job at removing nutrients from the land flows flowing into the wetlands. Generally, you may and most likely will need a resource consent around that. So, again, if you're looking at restoring a wetland, talk to your farm advisor, talk to the land management advisors at the regional council, and have a chat with them. They'll be able to direct you onto it. Another disadvantage is large land requirement, but it's a bit of a trade-off because usually it's poor production land. So you generally don't lose too much when you restore a drained wetland. When it comes to restoring drained wetlands, we have a lot of options to do. And most of the times we're around this filling drainage ditches or excavating fill. And this is pretty important this time of the year when with Cyclone Gabriel going through and we're having all these slips and sediment going through. Controlling sediments and restoring water quality, but the wetlands can be used to help that. Again, you don't want to put a lot of high strength or high nutrient loads into a wetland. Controlling exotic species, which is extremely important around Waikato and surrounding areas. Replanting, reintroducing fish and wildlife. Usually if you restore your wetland, these things come back. Controlling predators is always, and restoring those buffers. Again, like I said, if you give a wetland a little bit more buffer, as much buffer as you can of dry land, it just helps the wetlands in the long run. So in a general landscape, when I go onto a farm, this is a farm in Northland, you find these drained wetlands that, again, if you look at it, any farmer will, and most of you guys are looking at it and say, well, that's not going to be good grazing land, and it isn't good grazing land. But you got this drain, you got two drains going through it and a side drain here, and it's just draining this, and it just isn't doing a good job. This is a prime place to restore a wetland and capture all the runoff coming off the surrounding hillsides into there before it goes down into the stream down below. It's big enough it actually would hold bittern and a few other threatened species that we have. But, these are pretty typical around farms. You see a lot of these areas that could be restored. And just when you're doing your planning, you say, all right, over the next few years, when we get some funding, we'll restore that, and that'll help improve water quality from the runoff from the surrounding areas. Now, the big one, constructed wetlands. They do have a high ecological value, and you've got an opportunity to treat high contaminants. And constructed wetlands go from very simple to very complex. And I've seen examples of some overseas where they put piggery effluent through it. It's usually a 12 to 13 stage wetlands. And by the time the effluent goes through it, the water coming out of the bottom end is clean enough to drink. And I saw one guy who designed these in Ireland, and he was actually drinking the water at the bottom of it. And it's quite interesting too. Very simple, basically to to remove contaminants, you generally need that high retention time to allow the nutrient reduction, to the wetlands to reduce the nutrients, especially if you're treating high contamination. Disadvantage, again, it's large land requirements. You're not going to put a constructed wetland in where you want to restore wetlands. Generally will require a resource consent because of all the soil you're moving and that kind of thing. High maintenance commitment. Most constructed wetlands have piping in it and that kind of thing, and you got to keep those clean. And again, they're generally a higher cost than restoring wetlands. So this is why I always put the constructed wetland at the bottom of my list. Is this is number 3, because this is a high cost, and they do play a part in the landscape. But if you can restore wetlands and protect yours first, hopefully you don't have to do too much of the constructed wetland side. When we're doing constructed wetlands, we're looking at the wetland size to be about 1 to 5% of the catchment area. Shoot for about 3 to 5 to be better, for mainly the removal of nitrogen and a little bit of phosphorus. These wetland types are usually taking generally take surface flows. So the water flows off the landscape into the wetland. The wetland takes up the nutrients as it moves through the wetland. They're generally elongated with oval shape, with a ratio of a 5 to 1 or 10 to 10 to 1. You know, so along, and that deals with retention time a little bit. It's a mix of shallow and deep water. Usually, a constructed wetland will have a deep pool, which is usually a sediment pond at the top. Shallow water, which is less than 300 mils, and then usually another deep water end at the bottom. Those deep water areas allow for open water, so it improves maintenance. So you can see if your pipes are clogging. It allows for UV light to work on E. coli and reduce E. coli, and those kind of things. So we're looking for about a 70 to 30%, 70% shallow, 30% deep water. So here's a constructed wetland that was done by NIWA and Hawke's Bay Regional Council and up here in Hawke's Bay. Water comes in through this Kikatea forest into a sediment pond, and then this wetland is just being planted. As you can see, the guys down there planting, and moves through multi-cells until it runs out through here. This is 1.4 hectare big wetland, and moves through. They were able to save this lone Kikatea that was in the paddock. And so high costs. This one cost the council about a little over $300,000. Part of it was just the excavation and old river gravels. As you can see up here, this is all the soil they excavated out. They put it up into here, and so it was a little bit of a high cost, and they ran into a few things. There's pipes that go from each pond, well, from the sediment pond to the first wetlands, and then from the second wetland to the third to the fourth, and fourth to the fifth. So there's piping that needs to be maintained and that kind of thing. And if you have any failures in wetlands, it's usually those pipings. And you can see these guys are planting what we call emergent vegetation, and this area where they're planting is the 300 mil zone. So I tend to like a sort of hybrid constructed / biodiversity wetland and a field type wetland. So they're generally smaller because we only have a small area that we're treating. This is a 7/10 of a hectare wetland that's treating about 15 hectares of paddock, and it's got multiple cells. This one was just done a few months before the picture was taken, so you don't see any emergent vegetation growing up in this one yet. We haven't got that planted yet. And again, the water comes down, it'll go through. There's actually some deep water right here. We put a log in for biodiversity, and then it goes down through, and there's a few wetlands down through below. And the tiles are actually a good place to put a drainage wetlands, or a wetland, because you're taking that water as subsurface drainage off the property and running it through a wetland. This was the Pamahaka group that put this in. subsurface tile drops into a sediment pond and then works its way through the wetland. And again, these are nice, small, inexpensive to do compared to the larger ones. Putting wetlands into drainage ditches is a little bit of a favorite of mine. And so this is a drainage ditch. What we did is we widened this ditch and we put emergent vegetation here, put a little bit of a clay bund in here. So we actually hold water in this side of the ditch without affecting drainage in the paddock above. And then again, another grade control to hold it in this little basin, and in this larger basin, which hasn't filled up yet, is another wetlands that we did. Really easy to do, and we didn't lose any productive land when we do most of these, because they're generally, we're at the low end. The stream's right here. This little in ditch wetlands only treating about 5 hectares of drained property. We've got a wetlands above those 5 hectares of treating that one. So I kind of like these because it's an option for farmers and it doesn't take a lot of production land. If you're interested in constructed wetlands, Chris Tanner and the guys at NIWA and Dairy NZ have put in a lot of good resources that are well worth looking at. This last one, the Constructed Wetland Practitioner Guide, is a little detailed, but it has some good case studies in and will give you good estimates of costing when you're putting in wetlands. So potential edge of field wetlands is you doing your farm environment plane mapping, and if you got a nutrients, especially a high nitrogen catchment, and you want to remove nitrogen before it goes into the waterways, edge of field wetlands are actually really good constructed wetlands to do. And basically, when I'm looking at farm maps and farm environment planning maps, this low area in this area would have been identified as a critical source area, because that's where all your flow off the land goes down into, and that's where it goes down into the stream. And using that critical source area that you identify, if we put a wetland in there, we could treat all that runoff coming off the paddocks into that critical source area, treating it before it drops into that stream that's loaded with pampas grass, unfortunately. And when you look at your maps, you just look for those little areas as critical source areas, because they're actually probably the best place to put a wetland. It's not always as straightforward. This wetland was mainly put in for biodiversity, but a little bit of water quality, because we've got this whole hillside, but we've got multiple entries for runoff off the land to go on. So it wasn't easy to do a wetland in here that would treat water. And it wasn't really put in for treating water, but it will treat water. But what we have is this, it's not filled up yet, but we got shallow and deep water and multiple pathways for the water to slowly move through and get treated before it drops down into the stream system. So sometimes your critical source areas will have multiple pathways in, and you've got to move your plan around to make sure you catch those pathways in and direct them into your wetland. Constructed wetlands for treatments generally require large space, but I like putting if I can't get the space, we do these treatment chains. So like right here, we have a sediment trap and then a little bit of overground flow. This is all be flaxes and sedges. It was planted in flaxes and sedges right after this photo was taken into our wetlands, series of wetlands. There's 1, 2, 3 wetlands through there that this goes through. Again, it's only a catchment of I think 10 to 15 hectares, and this was 7/10 of a hectare large. We did put a open water space here instead of up higher, because the landowner wanted some open water in front of his little shack there. So, there's always got to make a little bit of things, but I put sediment traps, and I'll show you why I put sediment traps right above this wetland. The sediment, we put the sediment trap in, but I thought, oh, we didn't need it because there was a pond above it, and the pond would act as a sediment trap. But a few months later, we went in, it was filled with sediment, and you can see the phosphorus or the algae that's been that's taken off in there. So there was sediment coming down in there, and we were collecting that before it went into the wetland. If we don't collect that sediment before it goes into your wetland, you lose your wetland faster because that sediment is going to fill up your wetland and dry it out. So I'm a very big fan of putting sediment traps in. So an example for the Waikato just is an in-ditch wetland we did a few years ago. Just outside Arapuni. Basically, the landowner had a drainage ditch. It was a little wet down here, and so what we did is we widened the ditch. We put a basin in and widened and secondary ditch. This is the main flow of the ditch, and then we kept the original ditch in as an overflow during storm flows to bypass this whole wetland area. And the landowner grew all her sedges and planted that. This is a year later. You can't even see the drain, but if you crawl in there and look in there, you can see underneath, and there's good water flow through there. It's not causing any drainage problems upstream. Here's a little bit of a view from it from the bottom, looking at the drain just after we cleared it, what we've done, and then the planting a year later. So again, we just took that opportunity. It was land that was not productive, that actually we could put a wetland in without a lot of impact on the production. This was actually part of the farmer, and we're talking to Fontier's land management officer, and they were looking at this, and he said, "Oh, this would actually be a good place for a wetland." And we met up with them and said, "Yep, we agree with you," and we put this in, and it's just a beautiful little bit wetland. But it does show you that we can put wetlands in places without reducing your productivity. So just look for those areas as you're going through your farm environment plan. Where can I put a wetland in? Not only improve water quality, but improve biodiversity and those kind of things. Another little bit of time lapse on the top part of it. You can see how we widened that wetland, and she planted this up. This was all planted actually in the dry time of the year. It's planted in late February, early March. And a year later, it just grew in really nice. And again, this is mostly Carex secta, Carex frugata, and giant umbrella sedge, and just creates this little bit of canopy and very little weeds growing in there. And the water flows through it really well. It doesn't impact that drainage above. And I'll open that up to questions, Nardine. You're on mute.
Yeah, awesome. I realized, thanks, Nathan. That's wonderful. Caitlin, is there anything you would like to add at this point?
No, nothing from me.
Cool, awesome. So we've just had a few people say thank you. They've had to head off, but I do have a couple of questions for you, Nathan, and maybe Caitlin. So how do wetlands relate to the NES and grazing rules? And you've pretty much covered that.
Yeah.
In your presentation. How do you tell if a wetland meets the pasture exclusion in the NES?
That's that 50%. Yeah.
Yes.
Padding, yep. And wanting out, talk to your land management officers, regional councils, because that interpretation varies from region to region.
How can it vary from region to region?
It's just how councils look at how they look at the area of the wetland, and it depends upon council to council. I've had a few instances where Horizons was a little bit more tighter on that than I would have been myself, and Hawke's Bay was a little more open. So yeah, there's a little bit of how big of area where you're looking at, that kind of thing. So when you got that question, really talk to your land management officer, because they'll be able to answer that one. It is a bit of a challenge.
There've been some updates to the pasture exclusion list to check on, and some of that will vary region to region what we've got and things. Yeah, locally we pretty much go on that, look at the overall area, species on the pasture exclusion list, and yeah, go with that 50%, but we can sort of look at case by case.
Yep.
Awesome, thank you. Do Waka Kotahi have any authority over what can be converted to wetlands on private property if that property boundary is parallel to a main road?
You'll have to look on your lands
Yep.
report. I can only call it Lynn's report, but yeah. When you look, it depends what they have, what kind of buffer they have on that land.
Okay.
Around that road, because usually the road includes a margin, and if it's in that margin, then there's but they can't overstate the regional policy statement or the RMA. So if there's a wetland there and they want to do something to it, they will have to actually go through the consenting process like every other landowner will.
Awesome, thank you.
Right, Caitlin, is that a good enough answer?
That's about all that I have to add as well.
Yeah. So look on your what kind of right of ways on your lands, and yeah, and that's the best I could do. Yep.
Thank you. How much focus? Oh no, that's it really. That's it, because you've covered the other things, because it was about the EPP stuff and the farm environment plan thing. So those are the questions that we've had in advance. Is anyone on? We've got easements and or destinations are NZTA roading authorities.
Yes. Yep. That's what I meant to say. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, easements. Oh, is that what you were trying to find?
Yeah. You got to look and see if there's an easement, or yeah, there's on your when you have your report done. Yep. But again, they have to go through the same process that anybody else will have to through the regional council.
Cool. And the chat's open there if anyone's got any other further questions that I'd like to ask, or any comments to make. But we don't need to carry on if people haven't got any. But I want to give you a little bit of time to write a question in case you do have one, and I go, oh no, that's the end, and you go, oh, I'm in the middle of writing a question. So I don't want to cut anyone off. But at the same time, if you haven't got any questions, we also don't want to take up too much of your time, because I really appreciate you have coming along today and participating in this webinar today. Oh, generally, it'll be related to whether the wetland impacts drainage from the road. So referring back to that.
Yeah, even if it does, they still have to do a resource consent with it. Yeah, and thanks, Bex.
Yeah, that's also a lovely comment there. Thank you, Bex. All right, if there are no other questions, I could do a closing karakia if you would like me to do that, and then we can head off and enjoy the rest of our day. How does that sound?
Yeah.
But hopefully, what we've provided is an introductory start thinking about wetlands and how important they are, and to go yay for wetlands and let's restore them.
Yeah,
that's kind of our final message, right?
Protect, restore, and then create. Yep. And that unlock that. Yep.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so kua mutu amato mahi mo tene wā, manakita mai mato katoa o mato hoa o mato whānau eo ki te aorangi. And there we are. So that is, our work is finished for the moment. Bless us all, our colleagues, our families, peace to the universe. So I shall now finish, and thank you very much. We're getting some nice comments.